I was a duck run cowboy, you might say, because I had a little horse from the time I was, well, my first horse was a mule. And then my dad bought me a little ex-sulky racer, and she was a terrific horse.
The iconic cowboy actor Roy Rogers is on the auction block at Christie's through today.
It is, and it's kind of sad for the family to let it go, but you know, we only hold history for a short time.
For decades, the Roy Rogers Museum was a tribute to one of America's most beloved cowboy legends. But now, the doors are closed for good, and the story behind its shutdown is far more complex than most fans ever imagined. With fading crowds, financial struggles, and a painful family decision at its core, the museum's final days were anything but simple. What happened behind the scenes, and why did one of Hollywood's most iconic legacies quietly disappear? This is why the Roy Rogers Museum has been closed for good. The end of a legacy. Roy Rogers was one of the most famous cowboys in Hollywood. But there was a time when things weren't looking so good for him. His movies were losing popularity, and his career was at risk. So, he made a bold move. He bought the rights to his name and image. That decision ended up being one of the smartest things he ever did. Roy could keep building his brand by owning his name even as his movie roles slowed down. He and his wife, Dale Evans, used their cowboy image to sell various products, such as toy guns, hats, lunchboxes, and more. Roy wasn't just a movie star anymore. He became a full-blown American icon. In 1957, he opened the first Roy Rogers Museum in California, and later moved it to Branson, Missouri. The museum was a hit with fans. Inside, fans could find colorful cowboy boots, flashy saddles, and even taxidermy animals Roy had worked with over the years. The idea for the museum came after Roy visited the Will Rogers Museum in 1938. He noticed it didn't have much personal memorabilia, so he decided to start saving his things. When he retired in the 1960s, he put them on display for the public. One of the most talked-about parts of the museum? His beloved horse, Trigger, and dog, Bullet, were both preserved through taxidermy. Even Dale's horse, Buttermilk, was included. Roy was so close to Trigger that when the horse passed away, he couldn't bring himself to bury him. Instead, he had him preserved and kept the news quiet from his family for a whole year. Fans loved it, even if it raised a few eyebrows. But eventually, the museum closed its doors. Why? According to Roy's son, it was part of the plan. Roy had told his kids that if the museum ever started losing money, they should close it and move on. That's exactly what they did in 2009, after a few years of fewer visitors. Next came the auction. Seeing the collection split up was emotional, but the family knew it would make many people happy. Christie's held an auction in 2010 with 338 items from Roy's collection. Fans bought everything, most of it for way more than expected. And when it was all done, everyone sang "Happy Trails." It was a fitting farewell to a cowboy who left a lasting mark on American hearts. But to truly understand what Roy Rogers meant to his fans, we must saddle up and ride back to where it all began. Beating the odds. Before he became Roy Rogers, the man known as the King of the Cowboys was born Leonard Franklin Sly in Cincinnati, Ohio. In 1911, his early life was far from glamorous. He grew up in a cramped apartment on 2nd Street, years before that same stretch of land would be transformed into the site of Riverfront Stadium. It was a hard, working-class upbringing, shared with his 3 sisters, in a family trying to make the best of very little. Leonard's father, Andy, grew restless with the grind of city life and dreamed of something simpler. So he and his brother salvaged wood from scrap and built a long, narrow houseboat that could float down the Ohio River. In the summer of 1912, the entire Sly family left the city behind and began a slow journey upstream, looking for land and freedom. When the Great Flood of 1913 swept across the region, it gave them an unlikely opportunity. They floated their houseboat onto a piece of land they owned and, instead of building a new home, simply stayed in the boat on dry land. By 1919, the family left the riverside life behind and bought a modest farm in Duck Run, near Lucasville, Ohio. They built a 6-room house and began to settle into rural life. Leonard's father still couldn't make ends meet from farming alone, so he took a factory job in nearby Portsmouth, living there during the week and coming home on weekends, often with small gifts for the children. One of those gifts was a horse, and that single act would shape Leonard's life more than anyone could have guessed. On that horse, he first learned to ride, sparking a connection to animals and nature that never left him. Without electricity or a radio, the Sly family had to create their entertainment. Leonard found joy in music, often playing the mandolin, singing, and calling square dances when neighbors gathered at home. His voice, still raw and untrained, filled the rooms with energy. He also learned to yodel. During this time, more than a party trick, it became a way for him and his mother to call to each other across the wide open spaces of the farm. He began high school in McDermott, but after his second year, the family returned to Cincinnati so Andy could take another job in a shoe factory. Knowing how much his family depended on him, Leonard dropped out of school to work alongside his father. He tried to continue his education at night, but exhaustion always caught up with him. Once, after falling asleep in class and being mocked for it, he walked out and never returned. In 1929, after Leonard's older sister Mary moved to California with her husband, Leonard and his father decided to visit. They left their jobs, packed the family into a worn-out Dodge, and drove west. They stayed in Lawndale for 4 months before returning to Ohio, but the seed had been planted. Not long after, Leonard returned to California with Mary's father-in-law, and the rest of the family followed in 1930, hoping to start fresh on the coast. They rented a small house and took whatever jobs they could find. Leonard and his father drove gravel trucks for a road project, earning just enough to get by. But in 1931, the company folded, and Leonard had to move again to Tulare, where he picked peaches for Del Monte. The conditions were rough, and the labor camps were little more than dusty shelters. Still, Leonard didn't give up. These years would shape his grit, his empathy, and his understanding of hardship. He didn't know it yet, but these hard-learned lessons quietly prepared him for a future where millions would look up to him one day. The next big thing. When Leonard returned to Lawndale at 19, unsure of what came next, his sister Mary spotted something others had missed: his quiet gift for music. She encouraged him to try out for a local radio program called The Midnight Frolic, which aired in nearby Inglewood. Len, hesitant but willing, showed up a few nights later wearing a handmade Western shirt his sister had sewn. With only a guitar and a yodel in his heart, he played in front of the microphone. That single night, short and straightforward as it was, would become the start of everything. Not long after that radio appearance, he was invited to join a small country group called the Rocky Mountaineers. They weren't famous or polished, but they gave him something he hadn't had before: a place to grow. By August 1931, he became a full member. Within a month, Len placed a newspaper ad looking for more talent. That's how he met Bob Nolan, a Canadian-born yodeler who responded to the call for a tenor to travel. Though Nolan didn't stay long with the group, he and Leonard built a connection that would return later in a much more critical way. The Rocky Mountaineers didn't last, and by the spring of 1932, Leonard, Nolan, and a third singer named Tim Spencer began forming new trios, one after the other, trying to find the right mix. They called themselves the International Cowboys, then the O-Bar-O Cowboys, drifting from one name and stage to the next. But none of it quite stuck. Eventually, Spencer took a break from performing, and Leonard went to work with Jack Lefevre and his Texas Outlaws, a more established act on local radio. It was enough to keep him moving, but still not the big break he hoped for. Then, in early 1933, everything shifted. Len regrouped with Nolan and Spencer, and this time something felt different. They called themselves the Pioneers Trio and began to rehearse constantly, tightening their harmonies and experimenting with vocal layering. Nolan played string bass, Spencer handled lead vocals, and Leonard held the rhythm on guitar. Even while performing with other groups to earn money, Len stayed committed to this new project, while Nolan and Spencer began writing original songs to help them stand out. Their sound grew stronger with the addition of fiddle player Hugh Farr, whose deep bass voice brought a new layer of power to their music. By the end of 1934, a radio host suggested they needed a name that better matched their spirit. Since they were still young, he joked they couldn't be pioneers, so they became the Sons of the Pioneers, a name that immediately stuck and matched the tone of their Western harmonies and wide-open style. What started as a small-time group playing local radio gigs suddenly caught fire. By the summer of 1934, their music had moved far beyond Los Angeles, spreading across the country through short radio clips syndicated nationwide. The Sons of the Pioneers signed a contract with Decca Records and entered their first recording session on August 8th of that same year. One of the first songs they recorded was Bob Nolan's Tumbling Tumbleweeds, a haunting, drifting ballad that would soon become their signature track. In the next 2 years, they recorded more than 30 songs, including the timeless Cool Water, helping to define the Western music genre and introducing a new kind of cowboy ballad to American audiences. The harmonies were clean, the lyrics told real stories, and Leonard Franklin Sly was part of something bigger than himself for the first time. But that was just the beginning. Becoming Roy Rogers. By the mid-1930s, Leonard Sly had spent enough time honing his voice and presence on radio to catch the eye of movie studios looking for fresh faces to fill the boots of a Western star. His early roles were modest, small parts, and background performances in singing cowboy films, but he quickly stood out with his smooth voice, good looks, and easy charm. One of his most notable early appearances was as a supporting singer in a Gene Autry film, where he was still credited under his real name. But in 1938, when Autry got into a pay dispute with Republic Pictures, the studio began searching for a new star, someone with talent, charisma, and a smaller paycheck. Dozens of hopefuls showed up. Leonard Sly was one of them. The studio executives liked him, but they knew Leonard Sly wasn't exactly the name that sold movie tickets. They needed something simpler, bolder, something that screamed cowboy. They settled on Roy Rogers, blending the rugged feel of Roy with the last name of Will Rogers, the beloved humorist and cowboy figure of the time. Just like that, a star was born. Roy Rogers landed the lead in Under Western Stars, and audiences instantly embraced him as the clean-cut, guitar-strumming hero who stood up for justice. Over the next few years, Roy became Hollywood's most bankable Western actor, even giving Gene Autry serious competition for the top cowboy title. Roy didn't just appear in forgettable B-movies. He consistently ranked at the top of box office polls for Western stars for over a decade. Between 1939 and 1954, he appeared on nearly every major list tracking movie popularity and stayed in the #1 spot for most of that time. His success wasn't only due to his singing voice or horseback stunts, It was his personality. He played himself in most of his films, not some invented character. That familiarity built trust with audiences. They didn't just watch Roy Rogers. They believed in him. While other cowboy films stuck to black and white, Roy's movies after World War II were often shot in true color. A vibrant color process that made the Western landscapes, his signature outfits, and his golden horse trigger come to life. In many of these films, the plot would shift away from Roy to follow Trigger in solo adventures. However, while Roy Rogers lit up the screen and brought joy to millions of homes, behind the charm and cowboy smile, he quietly wrestled with personal battles that fame could never fix. Battles behind the scene. The world knew Roy Rogers as the smiling cowboy in white hats and clean boots, but behind the screen was a man who quietly carried real pain. Fame brought him into millions of homes, but it couldn't shield him from loss or make him immune to grief. More than anything, Roy wanted a family. In 1942, he and his wife Arlene adopted a baby girl, Cheryl. A year later, Arlene gave birth to their daughter, Linda Lou, and then their son, Roy Jr., called Dusty. But their growing family was suddenly shattered. Arlene died not long after childbirth, leaving Roy a young widower with 3 small children. The weight of raising them alone, while managing his rising fame, pushed him into a hard chapter. He was no longer just a movie star, he was a grieving father trying to hold his home together. In that quiet storm, someone familiar stepped closer. Dale Evans, his co-star and friend, had experienced heartbreak too. As they leaned on each other, their bond deepened into something steady. On New Year's Eve in 1947, Roy and Dale got married, not as a picture-perfect couple, but as 2 people who had found healing in one another. Their new life together brought more children, including Robin, born in 1950 with Down syndrome. At a time when doctors advised parents to send such children away, Roy and Dale chose the opposite. They brought her home. She was their daughter, and she stayed with them. Though Robin died before her 2nd birthday from complications of the mumps, her short life left a lasting impact. Dale later wrote Angel Unaware, a book in Robin's voice that reshaped how many Americans saw disability and parenting. Roy and Dale continued to adopt. In 1954, while performing in Cincinnati, they met a young Choctaw girl named Mary Little Doe, whom they called Dodie, and welcomed her into their family. On that same trip, they visited a children's home in Kentucky and met a 6-year-old boy named John David. Scarred by hardship, but still full of spirit, he greeted Roy with a soft, "Howdy, partner." The connection was instant. Roy and Dale adopted him too, calling him Sandy. Later, during a goodwill trip to post-war Scotland, they met a teenage girl named Marion Fleming. Her quiet presence and singing voice stood out. She became part of their family as well. Renamed Mimi, she formed a deep bond with them and remained close for life. Roy said she was as much their daughter as any of the others. In 1955, they adopted Debbie Lee, a young girl orphaned by the Korean War. She was joyful, kind, and full of energy. But in 1964, while helping deliver supplies to an orphanage in Mexico, Debbie was killed in a bus accident. The following year, Sandy died as well. 2 losses in 2 years. Roy didn't make a show of grief, but it marked him. He once said in an interview that without hard times, you couldn't truly appreciate the good ones. That summed up how he carried it all, quietly, with faith. As Hollywood changed, so did Roy's career. The westerns that had made him famous started to disappear. His longtime studio, Republic Pictures, let him go. His production company failed. New stars took the spotlight, and Roy had to sell off pieces of his past to stay afloat. Financial problems and lawsuits took their toll, but he kept showing up. He didn't quit. He sang for fans, signed autographs, and smiled through the struggle. Roy returned to Cincinnati for the city's 200th anniversary in 1988. Even with baseball legends in town for the All-Star Game, Roy was the one fans lined up to see. People gathered just to be near him at every stop: restaurants, public squares, and small interviews. One moment said it all. He bent down to talk to a boy and asked, "You probably don't know who I am." The boy replied, "You're Roy Rogers." That answer meant more than applause. It meant the cowboy still mattered, and always would. But time, as it always does, began to catch up with him, and the signs of age, once distant, finally settled in. Death of the legend. As his health declined from congestive heart failure, Roy Rogers spent his final days with his wife, Dale Evans, and the family they had built together. In those last hours, one moment stood out. Roy turned to his son Dusty, with whom he'd once been estranged, and quietly said, "I never thought I would see you in heaven." A simple act of forgiveness brought their long-strained relationship to peace. When news of Roy's death broke on July 6, 1998, fans around the world mourned. To many, he wasn't just an actor, he was a symbol of honesty, warmth, and the good in people. 5 days later, crowds gathered in Apple Valley for his funeral. Dale Evans gave a brief but heartfelt eulogy. "Heaven rejoices today, because another saint has come home." She and their children closed the service by singing "Happy Trails" one final time. Tributes poured in from presidents, musicians, actors, and everyday fans, remembering Roy not for his fame, but for his kindness and humility. He treated everyone with respect, and that's what made him unforgettable. Even in death, his values endured. He lived by a simple code: faith, family, and doing what was right. And that legacy continues, not just in memory, but in the lives he touched. Roy Rogers may be gone, but his blazing trail still leads. What do you think was the most surprising part of Roy Rogers' legacy that people never discuss? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts. And if you found this story interesting, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more mysteries brought to light. Now, click the next video showing on your screen. You won't want to miss it.